presume we can open it up by coming to some questions.
Planned on it, but
Alright, just. Will you moderate?
yeah. No, you go ahead.
Perfect. How long have you been here? How are you finding it?
So, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Laura Izarra by organizing this seminar. Kirsten is coordinator of Jamonet project here. We make the presentation of our panelists. It's a very pleasure for having Fintan Otuli here. So, Laura, we are taking a ride in your seminar. It's a pleasure for our institute. Thank you very much.
Well, it's just very, few words to thank our hosts, the International Relations Institute, receiving our Irish guests here. And then, of course, it is the chair of Irish Studies that is promoting this seminar, and we have many events throughout the year. But this year, this time, we are really very honored in receiving Maureen Murphy, Yolanda from Hofstra University, Yolanda Fernandez from Spain, and of course Fintan O'Toole that is here to enlighten us a bit about the Brexit. Thank you very much, and thanks Barry, the Consul General, for supporting the chair all these years, and I hope we will continue working together for a long, long time. Thank you very much for your presence.
Thank you, Lara. I think it's safe to assume we'll be working with the chair for a long time to come. The Irish Studies program here in the University of Sao Paulo was started in 1980 with Munira and Laura, and have been close friends of Ireland here ever since. Even they were here working for the good of Irish Studies even before we had an embassy in Brasilia. So they're perhaps our most important partners here in Brazil, and we're delighted to be here at IRI today to talk to the people here. It's quite a challenge in some ways to introduce Fintan because the scale of his achievements and contributions over the years are incredibly impressive. He's one of Ireland's leading cultural, theatrical, political commentators. And also, some of you were at the session earlier this morning in which Rosalie Haddad gave a very insightful interview of Fintan. So I don't want to repeat ground that's been covered too much. But I did think perhaps a good way to introduce Fintan was to refer to, again, to the Irish Nobel laureate George Bernard Shaw. And as Fintan was saying earlier, one of Shaw's great achievements was to legitimize a positive view about a questioning outlook, about the role of a skeptic in society and someone who can ask hard questions. And I think anybody familiar with Fintan's writings over the years will know well that he's never accepted the status quo. He's always challenged conventions and asked people to consider whether the establishment view or a well-held perspective is actually grounded in the facts. And as we move to a conversation on Brexit, I think that's ever more important. Shaw himself was an interesting character, and I think that the talk of the title of Fintan's contribution today is quite interesting, talking about Irish identity and British identity, when George Bernard Shaw himself was such an interesting figure, one of the great Irish writers, but someone who found fame and established his global reputation whilst living in the UK and observing Ireland, as many great Irish authors did from abroad. I thought it was interesting in reading Fintan's book and judging Shaw that Shaw's some early successes actually came through Europe. It was actually his Austrian translator, his work on continental Europe, that actually brought Shaw to greater attention. And I think, like Shaw himself, modern Ireland's success lies in Europe to a great extent. I think Ireland found its feet, found its modern identity when it joined the European Union. As our Minister Joe McHugh, said when he came to USP in March of this year under the auspices of the Chair, Ireland is completely committed to our European future. We've been very clear on the start as to what our priorities in the Brexit negotiations are. I'll leave Fintan to comment on other parties in the negotiations positions. But for us, it's been absolutely clear from the start that our priorities need to be to protect the peace in Northern Ireland that has been so hard won. We think inevitably Brexit will have negative economic impacts, but we've been working to make sure that those are minimised as much as possible. Obviously, we want to keep free movement between Ireland and the UK as open as possible to maintain the common travel area and ensure that there's no hard border between the south of Ireland and the north of Ireland. And in being committed members of the European Union, we want to make sure that post the Brexit process, no matter what the outcome of the negotiations, that our position on the future of the European Union is reflected. We want a strong Europe, a Europe that functions for its citizens, that functions for our businesses. So time is short now. We're over 2 years since the Brexit referendum, and yet somehow the outcome is quite unclear. So I thought it might be interesting just to draw from Shaw's work. He gave, given there's a lot of literature students and experts still in the room, Shaw warned the question of becoming a professional writer is a pretty deep one when the intention behind it extends to being a prophet as well. Now, I think it would be quite unfair to ask Fintan to play the role of a prophet, but I think you'll probably agree there's no better person to help us understand how we've gotten to the point where we are now. In 2017, Fintan won a series of accolades thanks to his publications in the Irish Times and in The Guardian and The Observer, winning prestigious prizes like the Commentator Award and the European Press Prize. So I think no better person to talk to us today on the topic of Brexit and Irish and British identities. Thanks.
Good afternoon, friends. It's lovely to be here again. This is my third visit here, which means you're very tolerant, I think is probably all I can say. So I just wanted to try to talk a little bit about, in a sense, the Irish dimension of Brexit and why it's so important. You know, it's not obvious why the affairs of one country should be so central to the future of another. Given, as the Consul has said, that Ireland is remaining a member of the European Union and Britain has its intention to leave, why should the two countries still be so intertwined in relation to Brexit? And I'd just like to try to explain this over the next 3 hours or so. I'd like to just address this at two levels. One is at the level of process, and the other is at the deeper level of meaning. So at the level of process, just to remind you, I'm sure you know, the negotiations between the United Kingdom government and the European Union, in a sense, are trying to deal with two separate questions. But in fact, those questions are not separate. But in principle, of course, there is the terms of withdrawal, the divorce agreement. And then, as in principle, separate from that is the future relationship. So this is, or could be thought about conceptually as two different questions. It's very much like a divorce. You know, you have to go to court to figure out the terms of the divorce, and then you have to figure out, you know, have you got joint custody of the children? You know, how do you deal with other things? One of the reasons why the Brexit negotiations have gone nowhere is precisely because these two apparently conceptually different questions have in fact become very much intertwined, and the point of entanglement is Ireland. So the Irish question arises yet again in British politics. Winston Churchill gave a famous speech in 1922 on Irish independence, on the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which led to the foundation of the Irish Free State. And he recalled, with that great Churchillian rhetoric, he recalled the First World War, of course, which was not distant in the past at all. And he said, roughly, that this war, Europe is emerging from a cataclysm, this great deluge, and everything has been swept away in this deluge. Empires, nations, assumptions have all been swept away. But as the flood recedes, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerge. The integrity of their quarrel is the one thing that has not been changed by the great cataclysm that has swept Europe. And it's a speech that was often quoted during the Northern Ireland conflict. What he meant by the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone, of course, was the sectarian, religious, ethnic conflict, Fermanagh and Tyrone being two of the border counties, as they are now. And he was pointing towards the sense that this is a sort of unresolved history that has not even been resolved by something as vast as the First World War. It's interesting. People quote that part of the speech a lot, but I went back and read the full speech, and it's very interesting because when he talked about the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone, it seems like he was speaking metaphorically, but he was not speaking entirely metaphorically, because actually earlier in the speech he explains that on the eve of the First World War, he was a member of the British cabinet. And what was the British cabinet doing as Europe was sliding into catastrophe? It was debating the parishes of Fermanagh and Tyrone, how you would draw a border on the island of Ireland. And they were obsessively looking at this micro detail of, well, where is the Protestant parish? Where's the Catholic parish? How can you draw the line between them? So there's a certain poignancy as Britain itself is sliding towards a cataclysm, that we have this strange situation in which this border itself has arisen again. And those steeples loom very large. The process question is, in one way, easy enough to understand. So, what's preventing the withdrawal agreement from being simply, let's do that, and then let's move on to the future relationship? After all, there would be plenty of time to do this. If you think about it, what should be happening is you agree a withdrawal arrangement. That's legally passed by the British Parliament, by the European Parliament, by the European governments. It's agreed as a legal text. And then you move on. You have a transition period is agreed of 2 years. And so in that 2-year period, why don't you just discuss your future relationship in the 2-year period? Seems logical. And the reason you can't do this is because of Ireland. The European Union has been absolutely clear in its discussion of the withdrawal agreement, so the first phase of this. Michel Barnier, who is the European negotiator, lead negotiator, put it very simply. He said, there are 3 things we need to tie down in the divorce arrangement, the withdrawal arrangement. People, money, Ireland. Okay? And these have to be tied down because they are the immediate questions, really, that the European Union cannot afford to leave unanswered as part of the withdrawal agreement. People and money are reasonably straightforward. So people means, what will the mutual rights of EU citizens living in the UK after Brexit be, and of UK citizens living in the European Union? They're complex, but they're the stuff of ordinary negotiators. This is what negotiators do, right? It's entirely feasible to come up with mutually acceptable rights. Money is about the divorce bill. How much does the UK have to pay to meet its outstanding commitments to the European Union? And, after a lot of grandstanding and Boris Johnson telling them they could go whistle and all of that, they've settled on a figure and it's fine. Money is not really fundamentally a problem. The third problem is Ireland. And the problem of Ireland is both a practical problem and a conceptual problem. The practical problem in turn has two dimensions. Right? So the first dimension of this is the border itself, the physical border. It's important to remember that when Winston Churchill was talking in 1922 about this border, it was a border which was seen as a temporary arrangement. So you had the Irish move for independence. You had this, had been rumbling on in different forms for a very long time. You had the Protestant majority in the 6 northeastern counties committed to a violent response if there were home rule, even for Ireland, autonomy for Ireland. And you had fears of civil war. You had, indeed, civil war in the south. And you had the idea that the way to simply get over the problem was to just hive off those 6 northeastern counties, to create Northern Ireland, and to have a temporary border. So the border was meant to be it sort of agreed. So you took the existing borders of those counties and you said that's the border between Northern Ireland and the new Irish Free State as it was then. There was supposed to be a boundary commission which was established to then look at this in detail and to sort it out properly. The boundary commission did meet and it never came to any conclusions. This is one of those borders that has no end and no beginning. Historically, it's an impossible border. So it's not a border which follows any real natural contours. It's not, mountain ranges. It's not. You don't have the Andes. It's a border, that goes across fields, goes across rivers. It's just to give you an example of its complexity. It's 500 kilometers of border. If you take the entire eastern border of the European Union, so all the border between the European Union and the Ukraine, Russia and Moldova, all of those, and then down into Turkey, take all of that. There are, depending on how you count, there are roughly 170 crossings. So the entire eastern border of the European Union has 170 crossings. Brexit will create a new western land border, which is the Irish border, which has at least officially 308 crossings, unofficially as many as you care to count because you can cross your own field. There's a guy posting on Twitter photographs of unofficial border crossings, and it's somebody putting 2 planks across a stream is a border crossing. So it's a border that is porous. It's so porous that this was one of the most heavily policed borders in Europe up to very recently. Right? So we know a lot about it. During the conflict, this is a border where it was heavily militarized. So the British Army had 10,000 troops on this border. You had armed police, you had watchtowers, you had helicopters, you had the whole apparatus of a militarized border. Pretty meaningless. It was so porous that the IRA, for example, could continue to carry out attacks across the border really pretty simply. It's not an enforceable or policeable border because it was never intended to be a border. So it is itself extraordinarily complex and difficult. And if you're the European Union, you're thinking, oh my God, we're suddenly getting a border which we never planned for, which nobody has ever planned for, and which somehow has to be now not, remember, just an internal border on the island of Ireland, but a border between the entire European Union and what becomes a third country, an outside country, the United Kingdom. So how do you control that border? Well, That's the sort of practical problem. And then the conceptual problem is that this is also a border which has, of course, a historic meaning to it. And that meaning is tied up with the broader conflict in Ireland, the sectarian conflict between Protestant Catholic, the colonial conflict between Britain and Ireland. And this is a conflict which is the subject of a major international treaty. It's not just something that we're making up out of our heads. You know, there is an international agreement registered with the United Nations called the Belfast Agreement. It's often referred to colloquially as the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. It's 20 years old. And this was the agreement to resolve the conflict within Northern Ireland, but it's also an international agreement. It's a treaty between the governments of the Republic of Ireland and the governments of the United Kingdom. It's underpinned by both the European Union and the United States. And it says lots of things, but crucially, it contains pre-existing commitments which cannot be altered by Brexit. And this is one of the important things to understand. This is a set of international commitments which the governments of the United Kingdom has made and cannot unmake unilaterally. It can't simply say we're tearing up that agreement because we're doing Brexit. And one of the things that the Belfast Agreement does is it confers on every person in Northern Ireland an ongoing right to citizenship of the European Union. Why? Because everybody born in Northern Ireland under the Belfast Agreement has a right, an absolute right, to Irish citizenship. So unless Ireland were to leave the European Union, that right to Irish citizenship is also ipso facto a right to European Union citizenship. So you have both the sort of physical complication of the border and you have the conceptual complication of how do you deal with the fact that effectively you have 1.5 million people. It's a small number of people, but in a way it doesn't matter conceptually. It's as difficult with 1.5 million as it would be with 110 million. You know, you have 1.5 million people who are entirely entitled under international law to retain their European Union citizenship. So you've got those two problems. And this in turn then leads us into the larger, these are the process problems, right, which is that you cannot then disentangle the withdrawal treaty from the future relationship. Why? Because if the withdrawal treaty has to answer the question of how are you policing this border and how are you justifying the continuing rights of all of these people to remain European Union citizenships, they have to be dealt with in the withdrawal treaty. And therefore, the future relationship comes into it because you can only answer those questions when you know what the future relationship is. So if you want to understand why the Brexit negotiations are fundamentally bogged down, perhaps the single most important reason is that through the little Irish door enters the entire question of what's the end state? What's the final state of relationships here? Because you cannot know that until you know, well, it's both, it's kind of circular. You can't know how to solve the Irish question until you have a sense of what the future relationship is, and you can't solve the future relationship until you know how you're defining the Irish question, how you're dealing with it. At a simple practical level, the border question is one in which there's a sort of a priori commitment from everybody. So in theory, this should be very simple. If you listen to the rhetoric, it sounds very, very simple. You have essentially three parties to this. You have the UK government, the Irish government, and the European Union. And they all say exactly the same thing, which is you cannot re-establish a physical border in Ireland. You can't do it. Why can you not do it? Well, first of all, as I said, for the reasons I talked about, it never really worked anyway. But secondly, because in a post-conflict situation where you have an uneasy but nevertheless very real peace which has emerged on the island, it's a peace which has involved, in a sense, being able to live in two worlds at the same time. So if I travel from Dublin to Belfast, I know, of course, in my mind, I am traveling from one country to another country, from one jurisdiction to another. I know I will have to change my currency, for example, when I get off the train station, I have to put my card in the ATM machine and take out sterling instead of euro. I don't know anything else. There's absolutely nothing else ever tells me that I've crossed this border. Actually, there is one thing, and I say this to people and they don't believe me because it sounds just like I made it up, but my mobile phone company is changing, and my mobile phone company sends me a little message. And I swear to God, the message says, "You are now roaming in Europe." And so I hear this ping, and it says, "You're now roaming in Europe." I'm in Northern Ireland. This practical problem is one that comes out of the fact that we've kind of evolved a way of dealing with ordinary life, which does not necessarily have to involve any encounter with the jurisdictional issue of sovereignty. To have peace on the island of Ireland, what you need is most people being able to say, I don't care and I don't know on a day-to-day level whether I'm in Northern Ireland or I'm in the Republic or not. So if you're a business and you're a lot of food business, for example, so most of the milk, for example, produced by cows in Northern Ireland is going to be exported to be processed in the Republic and then may well be re-exported into the Northern Ireland market and, whatever. Chickens, most chickens are raised in huge kind of chicken battery farms that span the border. Day-to-day crossing of the border is just completely normal. And this matters hugely politically, right? Because this day-to-day experience is a reality so long as it is not confronted with the question. So in one way, the solution to the Irish question was don't ask the question. Create a situation in which people don't have to, in their day-to-day lives, say, am I British, am I Irish, am I in Northern Ireland, am I in the Republic? And this works. It works. People are actually pretty good at doing this kind of stuff, and Ireland's a very good example of this. If you reimpose a physical border, you stop all of that. So you say, you must now declare yourself. Oscar Wilde famously said, going into the United States, I have nothing to declare but my genius. But you can't really try that on a European Union border. When you're passing, you have to declare yourself in a way. I mean, literally, you have to make declarations. And those declarations are problematic. But also the physical infrastructure is problematic. If you put a physical infrastructure back there, you create a target. There are still, the vast, vast majority of people on both sides of the island are completely committed to a peaceful future, shared future. But you have a legacy of dissident terrorist groups. They are praying for physical infrastructure on the border. If you want to restart a conflict, and if you just think about this, and it's a terrible way to have to think, but if you put 3 or 4 unarmed border customs guards on a post anywhere on that border, all somebody has to do is come along and shoot at one person. And then once you shoot at one person, you have to militarize the border. You have to protect those people. You have a duty to do that. And how do you protect them? You have to have armed police. Maybe you have to have soldiers. Maybe you have to go back into this whole thing again. And it's fundamentally destabilizing because it raises these big existential questions about the future of Ireland, the United Kingdom, all of those kind of questions, which were successfully parked by the Belfast Agreement. So that sort of practical question is very much there. And this is why everybody agrees, well, you can't do this. And then the question is, well, what do you do? How can you have a border between a huge multinational entity like the European Union and a third country like the United Kingdom, which has no physical infrastructure? The British answer to this at the moment is there will be some magic. I'm not being facetious. I mean, the more you ask them, they say, well, the technology. You say, what technology? Well, it hasn't been invented yet, but it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be able to do this. Boris Johnson actually, well, it's really not funny, yeah, but Boris Johnson, I kid you not, he actually said, in London there's a congestion charge where if you drive your car into central London, you have to pay a charge. And it's done, by electronically. Cameras will pick out your registration. And so Boris Johnson says it'll be just like, why is this a problem? Why would it not be just like going from one part of London to another part of London? Seriously, this is what they're saying. So the British don't have any answer to this. And the European Union has come up with an answer, which is the only possible answer. I mean, you know, if you think about this too long, your head will explode. But if you try to focus it, the only possible answer is an answer which says that Northern Ireland must have some kind of special status, and it must effectively remain in the single market and the customs union. At the very least, the customs union, but probably also the single market. Even if Britain leaves both of those institutions, Northern Ireland must stay in them. In one way, this is a very positive outcome for Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland could be, I keep saying it could be Schrodinger's country, you know, like Schrodinger's cat, you know, where it was neither dead nor alive. Northern Ireland could be neither inside nor outside the European Union, which is, you know, maybe a pretty good place to be. And it could actually get the best of both worlds. But Theresa May was about to agree to something very like this last December. She more or less agreed with Barnier that this would be okay. And then we have the kind of complicating factor that her majority in Parliament is dependent on the Unionist Party, the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland, which is extremely conservative evangelical party, which does not want to see any difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in relation to all of this. So Theresa May agreed to two contradictory things. She agreed that there would be no border infrastructure of any kind on the island of Ireland, and that there would be no difference at all between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. So we have this sort of contradiction which is unresolvable, and this is why negotiations are in deep trouble. That's the process question. And then I just want to refer to the fact that there is a deeper philosophical question, if you like, which underlies this. Why have we got to a stage where this is so difficult? And I just want to suggest that this is to do with the nature of the United Kingdom, and it's to do with the emergence of different forms of nationalism. So, to understand Brexit, I think we have to just simply acknowledge the existence of something called English nationalism. It's one of history's lost causes, in a way. I like to say that English nationalism faked its own death. You know, you get these stories where somebody fakes their own death and then reemerges. And we must remember historically, one of the first things that we can really call a nation-state nationalism is English nationalism. You know, if you look at it historically, it emerges very early in early modern Europe for reasons that we don't need to go into here. It's very powerful, and it's a very aggressive, self-confident identity arguably from the 14th century onwards. Why does it disappear? Well, it disappears because it can hide itself in two other constructs that seem to be attractive. One of these is Britishness. Very interesting, just as a small example, if you look at Shakespeare, Shakespeare never, ever uses the word British until 1603, when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and Britain has to be invented. So Shakespeare writes about this sceptred isle, this famous speech of John of Gaunt in Richard II, this sceptred isle set in a silver sea, as if England is an island. You know, Scotland doesn't exist. You know, Wales doesn't exist. And then suddenly, we have to be British. I mean, so he has to write about Britain. So Britain is an invention. And it's an invention that actually, if you look at it historically, the English didn't like at all. I mean, the great enemy, you know, the French and the Scots were the two historic great enemies that English nationalism defined itself against. The wild Scots to our north and the decadent French to our south. So Englishness as an identity was folded into Britishness over a period of time. And parallel with this and intertwined with it, of course, is empire. So the deal, the bargain is we can give up our sense of a separate English national identity. We can fold it into Britishness. Why? Because it buys peace on the island, which then allows us to conquer the world. Britain could not really properly establish an empire so long as it has a hostile Scotland to its north, so long as Ireland is so deeply unsettled. So the idea of Britishness is a way of buying peace at home so that you can construct this global empire. And of course, this works. You know, it's as a bargain, it makes sense. It's a bargain which begins to fall apart because, of course, the empire ceases to exist. The last great moment of sort of imperial nostalgia really is the Falklands War in 1982, which tells us how powerful the conception of it still is, but also tells us, you know, it's the Falklands. It's not invading France and claiming to be kings of France like the English kings did in the 14th century. So that imperial side to it is, of course, falling apart. But also then the challenge of Scottish nationalism. So it's all very well if the Scots are saying, yeah, we're British too. It's all, you know, it's sort of worse. Particularly if the English get away with, as they did, most English people for a long time used the terms English and British as if they were synonymous. People in Scotland would say, hold on a minute, that's, you know, we're not in England. But you know, for the English, it was okay to do that, and they thought it was. The rise of Scottish nationalism then sort of raises a fundamental question about the existence of the United Kingdom, about Britishness, and raises the not unreasonable question of English identity. You know, it's important that we're not patronizing about English nationalism. I mean, the English are as entitled to their nationalist feelings as anybody else is. You know. The problem is that it's an incoherent and poorly articulated nationalism. And the particular problem for Ireland is that it's a kind of nationalism which is fundamentally different from where Irish nationalism has ended up. So Scotland, for example, has had a very long period of thinking about its nationalism, of trying to sort of understand it and to sort of place it somewhere. And you can be very critical of Scottish nationalism, or you can agree with it, but it's a very impressive kind of nationalism. It's civic, it's not sectarian, it's not ethnic. You know, it has a sense of itself as a European identity, and you know, it's thought its way through that for a long time. English nationalism emerges without being articulated by anybody except the far right. So the only people, you know, 10 years ago who were saying England, you know, English nationalism, are sort of, you know, far-right neo-Nazi fascist groups. And English nationalism is treated in respectable discourse as an unrespectable thing. You're not really allowed to talk about it. And yet it's emerging. So if you look at the 2011 census, which was the last census that was taken in the UK, people were given a choice. You know, there was a question about nationality, and you could say, you could tick British and another one. So, you know, so I suppose expecting people to say, well, British and Scottish, British and English. A large majority of people in England chose English alone, not British. Not even British and English, but just English. And this was kind of ignored. It's sort of, you know, it was treated as a sort of a strange statistical quirk, but it's not, you know. So the problem is that you have a nationalism which is inarticulate because it has not been given a proper voice, and which is also self-contradictory. Why is it self-contradictory? It's self-contradictory because the only two things it can grab onto are an existing form of grievance and an imagined grievance, right? So the existing form of grievance is the loss of empire, right, which is reasonable enough, you know. But not many of us had empires as large as the British one and lost it. And so part of the articulation of Brexit, right, is a sort of nostalgia for empire, a reimagining of Britain as a global power on its own. We don't need the Europeans. We can recreate Empire 2.0. The old white empire, particularly, of course, you know, Australia, Canada, the United States, you know. Let's go back to before 1776. You know? It's ridiculous, but it's there. It's very, very powerful. And in a way, that's, okay, there's some logic to it. It's an imperial nationalism. The other form of nationalism is anti-imperial nationalism. And the problem with English nationalism is it wants to be that too. Why does it want to be that too? Because actually the imperial nostalgia doesn't really work. You know, everybody knows it's kind of ridiculous. Even the people who feel the nostalgia. It can't be properly articulated in the contemporary world. What can be articulated is the nationalism, the anti-imperial nationalism of grievance. We have been oppressed and we are throwing off our oppressors. Problem is, and it's a really mean thing of history to have done, is the English don't have an oppressor. They haven't been oppressed. So you need to invent an oppressor. And it is one of the most extraordinary things we've watched. I mean, watching a country inventing a self-pitying sense of itself as having been oppressed when it has not been is really rather extraordinary. So the European Union has to become the oppressor, whether it was or not. And in one sense, this may sound like a ridiculous thing to say, and I'll finish up shortly, but in one sense, the European Union, Brexit is not about the European Union. You know, this may seem ridiculous. It's actually about a nationalism that's trying to articulate itself, is trying to find a way to articulate itself against something. And the only something which is available is the European Union. Finally, why is this so difficult in relation to Ireland? Because Irish nationalism is a nationalism which has articulated itself over a very long period of time and which has come to a certain kind of sophistication. I know I risk sounding patronizing in saying this, and I want to stress, really stress, that this is not about Ireland being better than England in relation to nationalism. It's about the fact that Ireland did all the wrong things. We've experienced fully and in the most brutal ways where a monolithic nationalism takes you. We know it's a zero-sum game that nobody wins. You know, why? Because we've lived it. We've lived it in my lifetime. You know, and we've lived it really for longer than that too. But it's been a very live, murderous force. And we know that in order to get out of that abyss that you get yourself into with a monolithic nationalism, you have to develop a more fluid, sophisticated, complex, dynamic sense of nationalism. So Irish nationalism now is one of the more interesting ones, I think, because it's done a couple of things. Through the Belfast Agreement and through the changes in the Irish Constitution that came with it, it's redefined national identity in two really important ways. One is changes in the Irish Constitution stopped. So it used to be the fact that the Republic of Ireland claimed Northern Ireland as a part of its territory. That's a classic 19th century version of nationalism, right? You know, it's the irredentist force. You have our territory. We want it back. What the Irish Constitution now says is the aspiration of the Irish people to unite in harmony and friendship all the peoples who share the island in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. Right? It's a revolutionary change that what you want to do is you want to unite people rather than uniting territory. And the second big thing which is implicit in that is that you accept that identity is multiple. All the diversity of their traditions and identities. The Belfast Agreement has 6 letters that are probably the best 6 letters you can find in any international agreement anywhere. So it says, to try to solve the problem, saying anybody born in Northern Ireland has the right to be Irish or British or both, as they may so choose. So it says that national identity is multiple, is chosen, and is therefore contingent, right? Because if you can choose to be one or the other or both, you could also choose back. Right? It's a dynamic process, and this is a form of nationalism which we've arrived at, as I say, by going through all of the agony of the other kinds. English nationalism is curiously innocent. It is divorced. Even the sins of empire, that's down to Britain. The bad things that have happened are all British. English nationalism, because it hasn't been articulated really properly since the 16th century, 17th century, doesn't know these things about itself. It hasn't had a chance to reflect on itself. And I think this is why the conceptual problem of Ireland and Brexit and belonging is so difficult, because, in a sense, Ireland is talking one language about how Brexit must affect Northern Ireland. It must preserve the openness. It must preserve that multiplicity, that dynamism, that notion that actually the unit that's at stake here is a unit of people and not a unit of territory. That's our conception of nationalism, which really means you can't have a border. And the Brexit is really being driven, I think, by a very monolithic and unsophisticated sense of nationalism, which at the moment is almost entirely negative. And that's where I think you get this entanglement, which makes it so difficult for us to figure out where we're going. Thanks very much. Please. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. Amancio introduced me. I'm Kirsten Ingalls, coordinator of the Jean Monnet project of IRI, coming to an end, actually, at the end of August, 3 years of activities. And we're delighted to be welcoming Fintan O'Toole and Barry Tumilty again. Brexit wasn't on the cards when I arrived here at the beginning of this project. And having spent most of my career, 30 years, building European integration, it's incredible that many of our talks are about Brexit. And nationalism is a big concern for everybody. How many people in this room have European passports? And so I'm fascinated by this. I'm not really in the politics and journalism and so on. I would like, just as a Scottish person who is directly infected as both in terms of people, money and nationalism, and Ireland, I would just like to say that the nationalism in Scotland has recently been espoused by Nicola Sturgeon, the head of our country and the head of the National Party, that the nationalism in Scotland is defined by autonomy of decision-making and inclusiveness of peoples. So it compares very closely with the Irish modern approach towards nationalism. How it's going to play out, I don't know, because we don't have a constitutional definition, as the Irish have had the benefit of being able to do. So I'm going to moderate questions and answers. I think the best way is that we take 3 questions and we'd reply to them in order. Yes. Could you introduce yourself, please? Great question, Vivian. Next question. We'll just take 3 at a time. Great question, Patricia. Okay, one more, and then we come back to you, I promise. Fantastic questions. Okay, Fintan, you have the floor.
Thanks for those questions. They're great. I suppose firstly to take the question of class and generations, I think it's absolutely true that there's obviously a huge fissure within British society over Brexit, and maybe Brexit articulates divisions which existed already. The class question, I think, is often articulated in terms of people talking about, the left behind voters in the north of England, for example, who quite rightly feel that the political establishment has ignored them, let them down. The deindustrialization process, and of course, it has parallels with Trump in the United States, is very much there, and it feeds into a generational question, of course, as well, in that a lot of older working class voters see themselves as being stuck, physically stuck, in a way that younger people are not. I think, the generational question is, again, doesn't wish death on anybody, but one of the ironies, we were just talking about this over lunch, is that part of the stupidity of having a once and for all snapshot moment where 50% plus one of a population can make a decision for 100 years is that, if they were to take the vote now, or if, as I hope, they may end up having a second vote, demographics would actually already be different. So, not to put too fine a point on it, Brexit voters are dying. They're older. They're being lost demographically even as we speak, and people who are under 18 are reaching the point of 18 and being able to vote. So, the demographic question is very much alive. The class question, this is where nationalism plays its part. So, although it's absolutely true that you can see the pattern of voting for Brexit in England, it is, it's definitely the case that all through the North and the Midlands, all those industrial cities voted to leave. People tend to forget that so did Sussex and Dorset and all the Cotswolds and the very wealthy areas in the south of England. Effectively, the United Kingdom is 5 different areas. It's Northern Ireland, it's Scotland, it's Wales, it's London, and it's what Anthony Barnett calls England without London. And the Brexit vote is England without London. So of those areas, Wales is just a bit over the 50% for Brexit. Northern Ireland votes against, Scotland votes against, London votes against. The Brexit, but in England without London, it's something like 70% of the vote if you take it all the way from north down to south. So it is, in that sense, a nationalist revolution. Nationalism is a very powerful thing for making the working class fold their interests into the interests of an elite. That's one of its ideological functions. Why does a person in Sheffield, vote for Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg and people whose interests are entirely opposed to their interests? And I think the difference between Trump and Brexit is that with Trump, at least there's a chance for people who voted for Trump thinking he was in their interests to learn differently. The problem with Brexit is that by the time a lot of that working class vote realizes what's happened and realizes that these people do not have their interests at heart, to put it very mildly, it's too late. It's gone. And the question then is, this is where the Labour Party, I think, is so remiss. The people who should be speaking to that working class constituency is a Labour Party which is saying these people are out to deregulate. They want to get rid of all the labor legislation, all the environmental legislation, all the welfare protections, all the food protections, to deregulate you, to actually take away the very things that protect your whatever standard of living you have. So I think the missing part in the whole debate is actually the class question being properly articulated by a left-wing party which can actually speak to it. And I think that's the tragedy in one sense. The second question about a border poll, it's a very interesting question. So you may know that under the Belfast Agreement, it's agreed that at any point the British government effectively, if it thinks there may be a majority in favour of a united Ireland, in other words, of bringing Northern Ireland into the Republic, can call a referendum in Northern Ireland, and if it's passed, Britain has agreed that this can happen. Superficially, it's a very, very attractive solution to the problem. Not least because, and I think people don't quite understand this, but the European Union, and if you were thinking about this, if you were the Spanish government, for example, and you were saying, whoa, are we saying that a place can leave the European Union and then part of it can come back in? Are we actually saying that? And the European Union, to be fair, has gone very far in saying, yes, we are saying it in relation to Northern Ireland. So if you think about it in relation to Catalonia, for example, if I was a Catalan nationalist, I'd be saying, oh, yeah, I really like this, so we could leave Spain and then we could apply to join the European Union as Catalonia. But the European Union has said absolutely clearly on the record that if at any point Northern Ireland wishes to rejoin with the rest of Ireland, it automatically becomes part of the European Union. So this is one of the stupidities of the argument that there must be no difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. It's already different. It's fundamentally a different proposition, which is that for Northern Ireland, Brexit is a two-way process. There's a return ticket you could buy. You can get back in automatically, whereas the rest of the UK has no such guarantee, including Scotland, which is a really serious issue for Scotland. However, while it's very attractive, the problem is that Brexit does exactly what we didn't need to happen, which was to put the existential questions back on the table at a moment when we were just dealing with existence. So existence is getting on with the complicated, messy, ambiguous nature of life on an island and living with each other. And one would have thought that over time that existence would lead to, you could revisit the existential questions of whether or not Northern Ireland should exist at all, whether there should be a United Ireland. We're not ready for it. We're just not ready for this question to be put back on the table. But Brexit, in its recklessness, and particularly if there is a physical border, is actually forcing people to have to raise these questions at a certain time when it really shouldn't be. My own view is that it's somewhat misunderstood. The border poll does not happen in isolation. There actually have to be two border polls, and nobody ever says this. There's a poll in Northern Ireland, but there has to be a poll in the Republic of Ireland as well. And I'm not sure that people in the Republic of Ireland at the moment would vote in a chaotic situation with all of the economic implications and all of the uncertainty and potential for violence to say, yes, we'll do it now. St. Augustine famously said, his prayer was, make me holy, O Lord, but not now. And most Irish people say, we want United Ireland, but not now. It's an aspiration. But if you look at the Irish Constitution, the aspiration now is towards harmony and friendship and uniting people. And the problem is that the people are not yet united. The sectarian problem is still very much existing in Northern Ireland. But it's forcing us towards this in very unpredictable ways. This is where Scotland, I think, is very important. I think, you know more about this than I do, much more about it than I do, but I think certainly if there's a hard no-deal Brexit, I think the United Kingdom is effectively over. It won't be immediate, but I think the logic is that the United Kingdom cannot survive a no-deal Brexit. And if the United Kingdom is over, then in a sense we in Ireland don't have a choice. It's the existing status quo simply is not tenable anymore. My own view, and this may be seen as very eccentric, but I'm getting old so I'm allowed to be eccentric, is that perhaps, and this is blue sky thinking, but perhaps some kind of loose affiliation between Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland within the European Union is what emerges. you have an EU arc on the archipelago with England. Wales is another question, very hard to answer. But Northern Ireland cannot really be at peace unless it is both British and Irish. And the only way for it to remain British is for its Scottish dimension to remain honoured and alive, its connections to Scotland. I'm not suggesting the emergence of a single nation state out of Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic, but something much more like a sort of Nordic council arrangement, or that within there is a kind of part of the archipelago of what used to be called the British Isles, which we don't call them anymore, thank their goodness. But within that archipelago, there is an EU space, which includes Scotland. I think that would be a really very interesting outcome. But the problem is we're being rushed towards these things by this chaotic, irresponsible, reckless process. I mean, I don't like to be emotional about it, but it is scandalous that they've all gone off on their holidays. I mean, really, this is, they started the clock. They had no reason to do this whatsoever. They had a vote. They could decide when they wanted to start the clock. They started the clock really quickly, and the time is running out. And they've all got off on their holidays saying, we'll come back to it in September. This is March 2019 is Brexit. It's the irresponsibility of it is really quite shocking. Which has made me forget what the third question was. I'm sorry. Sorry. Oh, yes, your question about... Yes, sorry. Yeah. But, yeah.
They're both heading in a direction that
yeah.
both are hardballing each other.
Yeah.
And maybe the only answer is Great Britain, United Kingdom ends.
Yeah, but what you never want is a political entity to end messily and accidentally. My fear at the moment is that you're going to get, and I cannot think of another parallel in history where you're going to get a country in slow motion sliding towards a catastrophe without anybody really wanting it. So if you had a free vote in the British Parliament right now, there would be a very substantial majority for at least staying in the single market and staying in the customs union. But they failed to cohere around anything. There's no political authority. So the accident, of a no-deal Brexit. A no-deal Brexit is just catastrophic for everybody. But we're heading in that sort of direction.
It's not an accident.
Yeah. Well.
That would indicate that someone wants it.
There is a hardcore who wants it, but.
But I'd like to just comment there, just on the question of the position that Ireland are taking in the negotiations versus what's happening in the UK. I wouldn't characterise the position that we're taking as hardballing the situation at all. I think where we're starting from is the context of this international agreement that Fintan described very well, which is the basis for the peace that we've had on the island for the past 20 years. And our starting points, are starting from principles, which are there should be no introduction of a hard border. And then there's ranges of different solutions. There was a very famous tweet that Michel Barnier put out, which sort of pointed out the different UK red lines, and pointing out which solutions each red line excluded. Because the EU has a whole range of different arrangements. We have an arrangement, we have a trade agreement with Canada, we have the EFTA arrangements that Norway enjoys, we have a different set of arrangements with Switzerland. The EU has lots of different arrangements, but it is in a context of a legal situation. It's a context of rights and responsibilities. So we're not taking options off the table. It's more, I'd say, it's the UK that are articulating red lines that have consequences for the possibility of possible solutions. Ireland have been arguing for a position of principle. These are the outcomes that we want. These are the outcomes, or more particularly, this is what we want to avoid. And we're open to the paths to get there. But I think what hasn't been part of the negotiation until now is an acceptance on the part of some of the UK that some of these decisions have necessary consequences.
There's a very interesting development that I was just showing you earlier. 27th of July, a citizens' initiative has come before the European Commission, officially registered. They're looking for 1 million votes, 1 million signatures. Everybody who has a European Parliament, a European passport can vote. And it's demanding what's interesting is that it's 7 member states, and the Sussex University is organising something on this in September. 7 member states: Spain, France, Greece, Italy, Germany, can't remember the other, who have taken this initiative to make permanent those rights inalienable in the long term. And this would also be very interesting in an Irish situation where, in a hard Brexit situation, people's rights would still be
Yes.
constitutionally applicable in a member state. But okay, legally we have no idea what we have no idea what this would mean. Not for trade, not for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two just very brief things on that question around what's in it for the British. I mean, I'm a great believer in Sherlock Holmes. He's usually right about almost everything. And Dr. Watson says to Sherlock Holmes, like, how do you go about solving a really difficult crime? And Holmes says, eliminate the impossible, and whatever else remains, however improbable, must be the solution. So I think this is what, if you say, and I mean, I don't often find myself on exactly the same side as the Irish government, but what Barry has been saying is absolutely right. So like what Teshlum was simply saying, eliminate the impossible. I mean, if you agree that you can't have an Irish border, well, then you have to start with that. You have to actually eliminate that. And then whatever other set of arrangements you have to come up with, which may be improbable in the sense that they may have to be very creative and imaginative. They may have to allow Northern Ireland to have a kind of new sort of status that we haven't seen before. But that must be the way forward. There is no other way of doing this. The other very brief thing is, what's in it for the Brits? Well, remember what the British are saying, which is we are now going to go out and negotiate trade deals with 175 countries. Good luck with that. However, it's hard enough to do that. But if you're doing that on the basis of having torn up the most important single agreement, international agreement that you've made since the Second World War, which is the Belfast Agreement, then is anybody going to say, well, should we trust you in negotiation? You yourselves have said that this is the single most important agreement that you've made, that it's a solemn set of undertakings, that you've registered with the United Nations, that you're saying, this is our principles, this is our values. And if you destroy that, well, it's not a very good basis for going into a whole set of new negotiations with other partners.
Would you introduce yourself?
Yes, well, I'm Arlene Fenshaw from this university. Thank you very much for your speech. It was very, very interesting. I work with the Israeli-Palestinian mission, so it's wonderful to hear about the Irish development into a less monolithic
Yes.
nationalism. I'd like to really very straightforwardly understand what are the chances of a new referendum. I must say that I do have an English passport, and I'm thinking about putting it for sale. I don't think it'll be worth very much in the future if we don't have a second referendum, which includes possibly, why didn't it ever include English people who live outside? I mean, that's my case. My brother lived in Germany, and they were never heard.
Yes. It's a really serious question. Oh, sorry, you want to take more? Yeah, sorry, we'll come back.
Yes, please. I think you were next. Okay.
Say in part, your articles were the only thing on the Irish question prior to the referendum I read anywhere in the British press. So there's a certain element of total ignorance.
Absolutely.
People just didn't consider the question, and whenever I raised it, people said, this isn't the most important thing to worry about, we worry about ourselves first. Second, my question would be also, what is the end game for Arlene Foster and the DUP?
Yeah.
Because currently, the suggestion is here, by siding with the wishful thinking of Boris Johnson and everyone, that essentially she's acting in bad faith in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, because by creating this red line, they will not accept any kind of customs border between the UK and Northern Ireland. That suggests that she's willing to break the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, despite the fact that the majority of their electorate don't actually want to leave the European Union.
Yes.
So what are the DUP trying to achieve?
Yeah. Great question.
My name is Mark Gross, and I'm from Croatia. I'm a student of postdoctoral studies in corpus linguistics at this university. And I have two questions. First of all, you said that in not a part of Schengen, just like Ireland. So when we cross the border to Slovenia or to Hungary, we have to show our passports, even though we're part of the EU.
Yes. So on the question of a second referendum, my own, and I would stress that my own guess is as good as anybody's, because it's such a strange situation that I don't pretend to be able to be a prophet. But the logic at the moment is going towards the extreme outcomes. So, you would have thought that normally in negotiation you think, well, the compromise is always the most likely. I think the compromise is being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed because there is no political authority capable of selling it. When May did her white paper, she was saying, this is it, this is as far as we can go. And it's just nowhere near anything the European Union can agree to. So the only way that negotiations can go is from the hard Brexiteers' point of view, just get worse and worse. So they're just not going to accept it, and that's going to make, I think, any kind of deal just extremely difficult to see how it's going to be, done, and if it is done, sold. So you then have the two other courses, which are the two extremes. One is the sort of car crash, no-deal Brexit, which is a disaster. And the other is a second referendum. I think there's no other way out of this hole than another referendum, because in a way the British don't have referendums in their constitution. They don't have it as a part of their political system. It has no actual status. I mean, it's the weird thing about it. It has no legal status whatsoever. It's just advisory. It's bizarre to think that a country is going to have its future determined by an advisory referendum. But in reality, the only way to annul a referendum is through another one. Once you've done it, you can't undo it except by popular vote. I think the chances are rising of that because I think, the citizens' initiatives you were talking about, there's a lot of initiatives. I think there's a lot of political pressure coming on. There's a lot of people saying we were lied to. We know a lot more about Russian interference, for example, in the campaigning. We know that this was an extremely dubious process, and I think the case for rerunning it is very strong. Again, the problem is who's going to actually make that happen politically. The Labour Party should be doing this, and the fact that they're not, I think, is very depressing. The question about the DUP and what the DUP's end game is, well, I'm tempted to be facetious and say the DUP's end game is a united Ireland. If I were a zealous Irish nationalist, I would be lighting a candle every evening for Arlene Foster. I mean, I've been saying this to Sinn Féin. They're talking about having a border poll. I keep saying to them, that's crazy. I mean, was it Napoleon who said, my enemy is making a mistake, why should I interfere with them? It's like, this is, if you were a unionist and you're thinking about how do you preserve the union, I mean, this is the maddest thing you can possibly do. I think the thing to understand about the DUP is that this was recreational Britishness. It was a day trip. They don't like the Belfast Agreement. They didn't like having to deal with it. Of course, they weren't a party to it. Remember, they were outside the door howling, but they signed up to it because they got a bit of power. But they don't like the conceptual sides of it, the compromises. They've never really fully internalized them. But they kind of knew they'd have to deal with them, and then this was like a safety valve. You could wave the flag. You could be ultra British. You could hang around with the Brexiteers and feel very good about it and get a lot of money, of course, a lot of dark money, which was floating around, and it wouldn't have any consequence because it wouldn't pass. I think the thing you always have to remember is that the vast majority of those who were in favour of Brexit never believed it was going to happen. Boris Johnson told David Cameron in the phone call when he told him that he was going to argue for Brexit, he said two things. He said, don't worry, it'll never happen. We're going to be destroyed in the referendum. And then he said, even if it does happen, sure, it wouldn't be too bad. We'd still have a seat on the European Commission. I swear this is documented. Is that phone call? That's what he said. So they didn't ever think it was going to happen. And the DUP is very much in that mode. So the interesting thing is that most DUP voters, a lot of them are farmers, big farmers on the border, for example. If you're a cattle farmer, right? I remember talking to a cattle farmer, a Protestant cattle farmer who remembers the DUP, and I said, why did you vote for Brexit? And he said, oh, I'm fed up with the European regulations. I said, so you think that, buy our Northern Ireland unregulated beef is a good slogan to have, marketing slogan, And I said, what do you think is going to happen? So 83% of farm income in Northern Ireland is directly from Brussels. It's the check in the post from Brussels. 83%. And when I asked this man, I said, well, what's going to happen? He said, oh, well, London will give us the money. I just said, well, good luck with that. That's sort of, that face is. But I don't think they have an end game. I honestly think it's been, and you see, the problem was they got the sugar rush then of power. So this freak election result gave them this power in Westminster. So they feel they're in control of the process. And they get a lot of pleasure out of that, being central to British politics. But the underlying thing is I don't think they really understand what the implications for the Union itself might be. On your questions, when I said the English didn't have pressure, I mean now. Well, first of all, the Nazis never actually managed to invade them. So it's different to be involved in wars, which of course they've been involved in over their lifetime, but they've never been colonized. They've never been successfully invaded. They don't know what national humiliation is like. But we know what it's like. We've been colonized. And so we know it's not about somebody saying you're not allowed to have bananas that are too bendy. This hysterical overhyping of European regulations as oppression, is a form of neurotic self-harm. It really is just self-harm. And it doesn't really have any basis to it, except that, it's very like what we were saying about the DUP. The British Tory press has been doing this for 30 years. Boris Johnson invented it. So Johnson's a very important figure because it's not just that he kind of led the Leave campaign. He created the conditions. And he created the conditions by lying and lying and lying and lying about Brussels regulations. I will give you an example. I'm writing a book about this at the moment, so it's on my head, right? But and you're probably not going to believe me, but one of Johnson's main campaigns, he was the Brussels correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, Tory newspaper, respectable paper at the time. His big campaign was, we are being oppressed by the European Union because they're going to stop us eating prawn cocktail-flavoured potato crisps. What was the reality of this? The reality was that the European Union had a regulation saying, if it's a potato product, it can't have more than 25% added sugar. And then the British crisp manufacturers say, oh, but, we make all these exotic flavoured crisps, which, they're basically sugar. And the European Union said, well, yeah, but you can't call them potato crisps if they're full of sugar, And so Johnson started, like every day for, months, the bastards in Brussels, stopping us eating prawn cocktail-flavoured crisps. This is, oppression. This is tyranny. I kid you not, this is the kind of nonsense that we've been dealing with. The European Union was going to ban donkey rides on beaches. No, it wasn't. Boris Johnson told Parliament just before the Brexit referendum that the European Union had regulations on the size and weight of a coffin. You couldn't be buried in a coffin other than a European Union regulated coffin. Completely made up. These are just made up. So it's full of this kind of invention. And therefore I think what I mean by not having an oppression is not having a current oppressor to rebel against. Rebelling against Hitler or Napoleon is all very well in your head, and you're right to raise them because they are part of the psychology of this. But I think, in real terms, the thing they have not grasped is that sharing sovereignty is not the same thing as losing sovereignty, and that's what it comes down to. It comes down to whether or not you are willing to accept the fact that your power in the world comes from negotiation, comes from being part of other entities, comes from doing deals, comes from amplifying your own interests through the common interests of other people. And it's this us and them mentality, I think, which cripples their nationalism, I think, keeps it in this very kind of frozen state. So you asked me something else and I've completely forgotten. Oh, the Schengen. Yeah, so your point about Schengen is absolutely well made, but the Irish border issue is not an issue of the free movement of people. So one of the things that's agreed, so there's been a common travel area in Ireland and Britain from the time of Irish independence in 1922. It was just agreed for practical reasons you couldn't do it. So it's not really an issue in relation to the border. But even if it were, that sort of thing is not the problem. So passport control can be done in all sorts of ways. You can do it at a train station, or you can do it at an airport or whatever. But it's the physical border infrastructure along that border that's the real problem. And that is not. There are issues around movements of people. It's quite possible that the Calais immigrants camp, for example, could move to the Irish border. You could, if you want to get into Britain, if there's no border control, it's a simple way to do it. You just go into Northern Ireland, then you get the ferry across, and you're in Scotland, and whatever. So there will be problems in relation to that, but they're not the primary problems. The primary problems actually are the practical economic problems of tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers. So non-tariff barriers are much more significant for businesses than even tariffs are. The sheer amount of back and forward simply means that if you have to fill out forms for every single consignment of every set of goods, the cost involved is enormous. One of the things to realize is that one of the things that almost disappeared because of the European Union is warehouses. We used to have enormous warehouses for storing food in, and distributing it. That has shrunk to almost nothing because the British particularly benefit from what they call just-in-time food delivery. So the British have been historically food importers for a very, very long time. There's such an early urbanized society. They have to import huge amounts of food. If you're in a supermarket in London, if you buy a sandwich in the afternoon, there's a very good chance that it was imported via Rotterdam that morning. These are incredibly sophisticated, really very well-working systems. Once you have any tariff there, it means that you can't do that. Everything, it's not even the tariff itself, the money, it's the whole system breaks down. You have nowhere to store things. I mean, most British food companies, for example, just don't have big warehouses anymore. They just don't do that. They don't employ people to do customs declarations and all that kind of stuff. So it's just at every level, it just becomes enormously problematic. And remember, as you say, I mean, one of the ironies in all this is that the British have been incredibly good at getting their way in the European Union. They stayed out of Schengen. They stayed out of the euro. They've made their own rules to a very large extent. They've actually had a lot of control. The British also, remember, it was the British who designed the single market. It's a British invention. It's a British design. So it's a very odd and I think neurotic reaction, which is to do with all the things that we've been talking about.
British soldiers waged and fought on behalf of smaller European countries against the larger aggressor. World War I was in defense of Belgium. Ultimately, World War II was in defense of Poland. So when you go into the small towns, the Burnleys and the Blackburn that are so vilified, you see statues to men who died in trenches in Europe defending smaller European countries. So for want of a better word, the whole county nationalism, it's really a nationalism about why did we fight those wars if we now feel that our partnership with Europe, or the larger countries in Europe particularly, is not to our benefit for whatever reason it is. But they weren't, that nationalism is based on defense of the freedom of others rather than an imperialistic one, which is true in India and Africa and Asia and to a certain degree in the United States as well. So I think that's important to make a distinction there in fairness. My question is procedurally what happens in March in the UK. As I understand it, irrespective of what happens, Theresa May, if she's still there, goes into Parliament and there's a free vote. It seems to be almost a free vote, apart from the Liberal Democrats, on what the result is. Now, my real question is, on the occasion that there's no agreement on that date of March 29th, or whatever it is, that still goes to the front Parliament. And within the UK Parliament, there's only about 80 members at best that are really in favour of a hard Brexit. So a hard Brexit position is going to be defeated in the UK Parliament.
Yes, sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, yes. Yes.
If I were into illegal crime, smuggling goods, whiskey, or crime people, as you mentioned, I would be looking very closely at the situation.
Absolutely.
Very nice question, very brief, very scary. Very scary.
I'm not into illegal crime. Maybe I'll
My future career. Okay.
What is the consequence of no agreement with the
Yes. So just to take your 2 points first, you're absolutely right about First World War, Second World War being much more important in English consciousness than the imperial wars. George Orwell, I was reading a thing he wrote recently in the 1940s saying, that the English working class has always dealt with the empire by pretending it doesn't exist. And so the searing experiences of those two great European wars are obviously much more important. There is a strange thing, and I think we have to be fair to the English in relation to this, which is that I can't think of any other parallel where a country wins a really major existential war and within 10 years is looking at the defeated powers and saying they're doing better than us. So after the Second World War, so by the mid-1950s, the three Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany, are all growing at phenomenal rates economically and are growing at much, much higher rates than Britain itself is. Britain bankrupted itself in order to fight the Second World War on everybody's behalf, and I'm really grateful that it did, and I'm not being at all sort of facetious about this. And it is, I think, a unique and searing historical experience. And I often say, and it does sound facetious, that they never got over winning the war, but it's kind of true that you can see the grudge, you can see the resentment, which is there, which is this common market as it was, they're all doing really well, and they're the countries that either made war on us or the countries that we saved from the Nazis, like the French and the Belgians and the Dutch. And we're outside of this, and we're experiencing economic decline and losing an empire. So it's a reasonable thing. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Country. So Germany in particular is most economic for all of the industrious of the Germans.
Absolutely.
Huge. If you were to take the inflated dollars that the Marshall aid put into Germany, it's in the trillions.
Oh yeah. No,
it's in the trillions in 1945.
Yeah.
Not in 2015.
Sure. So there are reasons for the British to feel historically aggrieved, right? I just think this is self-harm. So it's like you cannot compensate for what might seem like a historic injustice by, cutting your own arm. It just doesn't work. The question about smuggling, I think, is a really interesting question. I think organized crime would be a really interesting thing to be going into right now, because. First of all, the Irish border, if everybody is saying there will be no border infrastructure, you have a 500-kilometer border, a lot of which is unpoliceable, right? It's across tiny little roads and streams and everything else, between a 27-member trading bloc and the UK. And you're going to have differential tariffs, you're going to have differential values on either side of that. I mean, just think about the consequences. It's already a border, by the way, in which lots of people make money out of smuggling. Even now, things like petrol, there's different VAT rates or tax rates on it, so people, there's a lot of that going on. But then if you think about this on a wider level, remember the British White Paper says the British proposal for how tariffs will work after Brexit is we will collect two different sets of tariffs. So if you're bringing something into the UK from outside, you will say, is this staying in the UK or is it going on to the European Union country? If you say it's staying in the UK, we'll charge you a lower tariff, and if it's going to a European Union country, we will collect the European Union tariff. Now, I'm not, I hope, of great criminal masterminds potential, but it strikes me there's a kind of opportunity there, right? So you just simply, you import lots of stuff and you say, oh, it's all staying in the UK. Once you've got those differential tariffs, the incentive for smuggling, for fraud, for all sorts of stuff going on is absolutely enormous. The last question about the consequences of no-deal Brexit. I mean, I don't want to be too alarmist about it, but they are really quite catastrophic, you know. You see, I think one of the things that people don't understand about a no-deal Brexit is it's not just about what a no-deal Brexit itself would mean, which is very bad, right? Which is the immediate consequences are. I mean, there's a reason why they're stockpiling food. I mean, they're stockpiling food. It's like wartime. They're stockpiling medicines. You know, so much of this stuff is imported, and it's imported under regulation. It's not just that you have to get the stuff in. You know, it's imported under. So all medicines in the United Kingdom are regulated by the European Medicines Agency. All aviation out of the United Kingdom is done under the European Open Skies Agreement. You literally cannot you can take off from London, you're fine, you can circle around. You can't land in Paris. You know, you have no legal right to land an aircraft outside of the European Union Open Skies Agreement, anywhere within the European Union. If you're in Dublin, I mean, one of the busiest air routes in the world is Dublin to London. I mean, you can't fly from Dublin to London. You know, this is just insane stuff at every level. But in a way, it's even worse than that, because if it were a no deal, part of the politics of no deal is Britain saying we're not paying the 40 billion that we agreed to pay. If Britain is not paying, you have hostility and resentment on the part of the European Union. So the things that might quickly sort themselves out. So what you would expect in a no-deal catastrophe situation is the European Union would say, okay, let's do a quick fixed deal on aviation, for example, or on medicines, or on all nuclear materials, for example, to power the nuclear power stations. All that's covered under European legislation. Let's do quick deals on these things. But if Britain is saying we're not paying, we're running away and we're taking the ball and we're doing our own game, how politically likely is it that the European Union is going to make concessions to try to keep things going? So you would have both, I think, practical chaos in terms of all of these questions, but also political chaos. You would have, and then you would also have, and I think you raised this question, procedurally, in England, yeah. So remember, this is why the business of the clock ticking is so serious, because you have to go through from where we are at the moment, right? Just to get to the other side with some kind of sanity, you have to get a withdrawal agreement agreed, which includes the Irish question, on which, so far as I can see, we are no further along than we were 2 years ago. You then have to get a framework agreement for future relationships agreed. It doesn't have to be, dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and full detail, but it has to be a pretty robust framework agreement for what the future relationship is. You then have to have that accepted by every single European member state, remember. So it's not just, the European Commission as a whole or whatever accepts this. Every single European member state has a veto over this. So the European Parliament has to pass it. And I think this is your most important procedural question, is the British Parliament has to pass it. And at the moment, although you're absolutely right to say the hard Brexiteers are a minority, there's maybe 60 of them, maybe 80, depending on how you define it. They are a small minority, but everybody you talk to who breaks it down otherwise says there is no majority for any outcome in the British Parliament currently. You have a very large number of people who want a very, very soft Brexit. You have a large number of people who want no Brexit. You have a large number of people who want a no-deal, completely crazy Brexit. And you have a large number of people who want a Theresa May's kind of compromise thing. But putting that together in some way that it's a majority which is going to accept it. So May had to agree to give Parliament what's called a meaningful vote on the deal. So let's say, okay, the good scenario is we get through all of this. May puts it to Parliament, and Parliament says, okay, fine. Then Brexit happens as of March 2019. You will then have a transition period probably of 2 years where, things begin to be sorted out in practical terms. And it's not too catastrophic for anybody. It can be dealt with. The more likely scenario at the moment, even if you kind of exclude, Theresa May losing power, which she could very well do, but even if you assume she gets to that point, Parliament then says, say it's a no deal, Parliament then says, actually, we don't want no deal, we want to send you back to negotiate a deal. The European Union says, well, look, I'm really sorry, but you had 2 years, and you didn't do it. Legally, Article 50 is a legal document. You asked for this. You set this clock running. What does the European Union do in that case if there's no deal after 2 years? Does it say, well, actually, we'll set aside our treaty? In order to do that procedurally, again, every single member state individually would have to agree to an extension. Does Orban, for example, in Hungary say, well, I'll only agree to this if you, make Hungarian the first official language of the European Union? So, the potential for crazy stuff to start happening there is enormous. That's in the case of no deal. But also, if it's got to a point of no deal in March, it's very difficult to see how you get out of that. I mean, what kind of deal is going to suddenly arise that's going to get over those problems? The other scenario, and this I think, if I was guessing, I would say, some kind of patched up deal is done. The majority of the Tory party is deeply unhappy with it. The majority of Parliament is deeply unhappy with it. Because it's full of compromises, the Tory press is going crazy. The Daily Mail is running front page things about traitors and saboteurs, and they've already been doing this, enemies of the people, all that sort of stuff was going. And you see, if there is a deal, there are about 20 different reasons for people to vote against the deal, right? So all the people who don't want to leave can vote against the deal. All the people who think the deal is a bad deal can vote against the deal. And all the people who want a no-deal Brexit can vote against the deal. So it's very likely that even if it's a patched-up deal, Parliament will reject it and say, go back and renegotiate the following things. And what does the European Union do then? The sheer kind of complication of it is such that this is where the risk of the accidental no deal, I think, is very, very high. That you get to a point where only a tiny minority of people actually want it, where almost every single independent expert or commentator, anybody who's evidence-based, says this is catastrophic economically and socially and politically, but where it happens anyway simply because the mechanics of getting out of it are so difficult that it just kind of slides into it. What you would need to see happening in order to avoid this, really, is a cross-party, very powerful set of statements in September, I mean, really next month, saying, look, we've got to avoid this. This is national self-harm on an epic scale for no reason. We need to come together to negotiate either a second referendum or a sensible deal that does the least amount of harm possible. And there's a way of then, if you had a kind of cross-party consensus on that, you could say, okay, the first option is let's try and do a sensible deal where we stay in the customs union, we stay in the single market, and we try to limit the harm. And then we put that to Parliament, and we also agree if Parliament doesn't agree to that, then there's a second referendum. That's the only procedural way out of it that I can see. But can I see that happening? Can I see them getting to that point? At the moment, there's just no authority. There's just a vacuum of authority. When Brexit happened, I had to write a piece at 5 o'clock in the morning. Everything goes online now immediately. I was watching this stuff and thinking. And this image came into my head from somewhere. Yeats would have called it the animamsy or something. This image comes up. And I remember vaguely seeing a drunken person after a wedding. And the trick that people can do where you pull the tablecloth out and everything stays on, you can do it so quickly. And I thought, but if you see a drunken person doing it, it doesn't work. It's like, pull the tablecloth and everything falls. And, I think the idea of Brexit is you're taking out a layer of governance and authority, and everything else will just stay the same. Scotland will stay the same. The United Kingdom will stay the same. Northern Ireland peace process will stay the same. Everything will stay the same. But it's not like that. When you remove that layer of authority, what they've been left with really is an absence of any authority. There is nobody currently in power or close to power in Britain who is able to exert the good authority of saying, hold on a minute here, folks, we are in danger of committing an act of appalling self-harm, which will have terrible consequences for the very poorest, most vulnerable people, many of whom voted for this thing. And it needs somebody to be really angry about the Brexiteers. It needs somebody to be really angry about, how dare you do this to your country? You call yourself patriots, and you're doing this to your country and your people in the most reckless, ill-considered way. You have no plan, you have no authority. The reason they've all resigned, why has Boris Johnson and David Davis resigned? Because they don't want to be around to take responsibility for anything. These people have put their country into this situation and they're just walking away. Boris Johnson walked away. Yeah. Rees-Mogg, who's the most zealot Brexiteer, you're absolutely right. He runs 2 hedge funds. He's very, very wealthy. He's moved the hedge funds to Dublin. One of the other Brexiteers runs a financial advice business, and their main growth area, he's giving financial advice on how to Brexit-proof your business. Lord Lawson, who was the chair of the Leave campaign, Dominic Lawson, the former Chancellor, has moved to France and has taken out permanent residency in France. Nigel Farage is married to a German woman. His children have German citizenship. Boris Johnson makes more money out of writing newspaper columns than he made from being foreign minister. That's the thing you have to understand. He walked out of being the worst foreign minister in their history to taking up his newspaper column for the Daily Telegraph, for which he is paid £275,000 a year, which is even more than I'm paid by the Irish Times for writing column. But they benefit from this stuff. It's a game. It really is shocking. It just as an example of just utterly reckless leadership. And the problem then is looking for where's the alternative? Where is this? And somebody needs to say, there's a woman called Anna Soubry, who's a Conservative MP, who stood up in Parliament just before it and pointed at them and said, people didn't vote to be poorer while you people with your gold-plated pensions get to run off for the lifeboats. And this is the Titanic again. This is the Titanic where they play ragtime music, to keep the poor people down in third class, thinking it's all okay, while the wealthy are running for the lifeboats. And it really is morally very, very difficult to condone any of it, because I don't think it's even sincere. I don't think people make mistakes, but I don't think this is even a sincere mistake. It's a cynical exercise. And the harm that's being done is terrible. But I just hope that public pressure from businesses, pressure from civil society will mount enough in the autumn for there to be a public demand of the political system. You've got the majority, which is there to try to avoid harming your country, has to come together and do this. I don't think she will. I mean, whatever else you think about Theresa May, and she's not an impressive figure, but I actually think, to be fair to her, I think Theresa May, in her own very narrow way, is a patriot. I think she does understand that there's terrible harm can be done in this, and she's trying to do her best. I don't think it's a very good best, but I genuinely think she's trying to do her best to get out of this without doing irreparable harm to the country. And I don't think she's going to walk away. She could, however, be deposed, I think, in the autumn by a rebellion. Once the European Union comes back with its response to the British White Paper and says, look, yeah, it's a basis for negotiation, but the role of the European Court of Justice is going to be much higher. You can't do this, you can't do that. I think at that stage there'll be a major rebellion from the Brexiteers, and they'll try to oust her.
I think that we're out of time. Fantastic debate, guys, in Brazil on Brexit. Very, very interesting, Fintan. Excellent. I would recommend anybody with a passport for one of the EU member states, to go and sign the Citizens' Initiative for Permanent Fundamental Rights. And it's one of the bottom-up approaches to controlling this nationalism and the removal of individuals' rights. including mine. I wonder if I'm angry enough to be able to get something done. Probably would burst a few blood vessels on the way. But anyway, thank you very much. That was great. And I'd like to pass the microphone to Professor Laura to close.
Just say that there is a coffee in the room aside here.
Well, thank you very much for your presence, and thank you, Fintan. I think that you have covered everything, but you have so many things still to say to us. But then you will come back again to Brazil to continue this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What's going to happen in Scotland? I mean, people won't, in the long term, people can't deal with it.
Very well. And nice to meet you. Okay. Last year, Ireland's Minister of Education took part of an event hosted by the university chairs of Irish students, saying that many people from Northern Ireland were filing for Irish citizenship so they could keep being part of European Union. It is still happening, and what are some other consequences filtering Ireland plus Brexit?
So it is true that a lot of people in Northern Ireland are taking out Irish citizenship. Also, quite a lot of people in Britain who have an Irish grandparent, they're entitled to take Irish citizenship. So it's very interesting to see this happening. Irish citizenship is becoming more attractive to a lot of people because of the European Union. Within Ireland, it's very interesting, I think, because I think a lot of those people, you have to understand, will be coming from a Protestant background, who have traditionally looked more towards Britain, see their own identity as being British. So for them to take out an Irish passport is a big thing. It's not just a little administrative thing, it's a big identity question. I think most of those people will also keep their British passport. So you must remember they are legally entitled to Irish or British or both. So they can't have both identities. And so I think in the short term, it's not so much that the political implication is that these people want to join United Ireland. I think it may be more that they're beginning to understand that they have a certain kind of advantage, which is that maybe identity is not something that's kind of just fixed, that you can have two identities, that you can use it in different ways. So my hope is that maybe one of the consequences of Brexit, if we can avoid it being traumatic and hard, is that people on both sides of the island will communicate more with each other. They will realize they have common interests, which are not necessarily big political interests. They're just interests in living together and being on the same island. And I think this is happening. People are afraid of the border because they have more contact, and therefore they don't want to go back to a time when they didn't have that contact. So I think it's a very difficult situation. It's very worrying, but it also has maybe medium term some positive potential.
Do you see any similarities between migrations movement to Europe and to South America and more specifically Brazil? Because there are different things, but are similar.
Yes. Well, Brazil, I suppose, famously, at least as we look at it from the outside, is an outstanding example of a mixed society, a society in which people can feel Brazilian without having a single ethnic background. So you don't have a possibility of saying, well, we are Brazilian because my grandfather, my grandmother, my great grandfather, came from Brazil, and it's all in a straight line. I think, and very much saying this from the outside, but I'm not saying there are not difficulties in Brazil with race and with ethnicity, but you just can't pretend that nationality is the same thing as race or the same thing as ethnicity. I think what's happening in Europe is that people are only beginning to get to grips with that reality. So most European countries are used to thinking of themselves as being ethnically similar. That you have a Germanness or Frenchness or Englishness or Irishness. And of course the reality is that if you think about it historically, nobody's really like that. Every history is mixed and confused and ambiguous, and every society over a long period of time has always experienced immigration and mixture. But the nation states in Europe, from the 19th century started thinking of itself as kind of very much about this kind of ethnic purity. And I think one of the things going on at the moment is that people are uncertain and confused about how they're supposed to think about their nationality. So if you tell people you must think about yourself as an ethnic nationality, and then they're confronted with people coming from Syria or somewhere else, there's a logic to them saying, well, you're not our people. Our people are people who belong to you. So the challenge is maybe one that you've already faced in prison, which is to think about what kind of nation can we have without having to say that we have an ethnic monolith. People are from very different kinds of cultural and racial backgrounds. I'm actually quite optimistic about this. It's easy to get stuck in a time when you think this is a crisis, and it is a crisis, and it's difficult, and we have a far-right reaction to it. The most interesting thing, I think, is that if you look at a lot of this, globally, is that most anti-immigrant feeling is usually in places where there are not very many immigrants. That's the paradox. The people who vote for Trump, the biggest numbers are in places where there are very few immigrants. In fact, the same with Brexit. The places that voted most for Brexit, people say we hate these immigrants, they must go. Look, there are no immigrants in these places because they're poor places. Immigrants go to places where they can get jobs. If you look at London, for example, which is a really multicultural city, voted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union. The reality is that people's experiences over time are that none of us is very far away from migration. That once you begin to get used to the idea that people are diverse, most people actually like it, or at the very least they live with it, they take it as normal, and it ceases to be this huge problem. Historically, the only difference between an immigrant and a non-immigrant is time. Nobody in England, apart from a few lunatics, is going to say, those Jewish migrants who came in the 19th century are terrible people. But in the United States, even Trump isn't saying, we should never let those Jewish people in the 19th century, or those Irish people in, or those Italians in. Wave after wave of migration comes, and they are integrated into the society, and then there's a new wave, and the new wave become the out people who are different, who are not to be accepted. But over time, it's interesting being Irish because, for a long time in the United States, for example, the people who are most hated, the people who are seen as the most dangerous, dirty, difficult immigrants were the Irish, because they were very poor. They were Catholic. Being Catholic was a really bad thing in the Protestant United States. So you could read almost exactly the same kinds of things being said about the Irish in 19th century America as Trump is saying now about Mexicans or Muslims, almost word for word. And the irony, of course, is that a lot of people who are around Trump are Irish Americans. Kelly and Conway and all these people, they're all Irish Americans. Their ancestors were the very same people who were the incoming migrants who were being abused by the Trump administration. So you have to hope that we learn over time, if we just think about our own experiences, the reality of our experiences is not that we will always hear migration is completely part of human history. There is no human history without migration. And so this is why I think historical consciousness is a very important aspect of politics. Sometimes politicians say, why do you have university? Who cares about, these bloody academics going off and studying history? But actually history is about survival. We don't survive unless we actually understand the truth of our own stories. So maybe we can use some sense of who we are, not in the negative way of saying, well, you're not like us, but actually in a real sense of saying, if we really know who we are, we know that we're not really that different from you. We've all sometimes when you write a book, you have different motivations. I was a theatre critic for a long time. I've written a lot about theatre, so I was interested in GBS from that point of view. But the big reason for doing a book was actually I was thinking about my father. You know, my father was one of those people for whom GBS mattered a lot. GBS was a great hero to uneducated people who were educating themselves, because he wrote about very complex things and big issues, politics, feminism, socialism, and all those things. But he wrote in ways that were very accessible and attractive to people, funny, amusing, provoking. And when I was a child, my father had no education, but he had these GBS books. He always had them in the house because they were mass produced. He was one of the first figures who was the books were sold as cheap paperbacks, millions and millions of them. You could buy them secondhand in the streets for almost nothing. So my father had all of these books, so I used to talk to him about GBS. You know, maybe it was because also Dublin is a small city, and where GBS was born was just down the road from where we lived. He felt like it was a kind of local character, even though he wasn't, but it felt like he was kind of one of us. So I suppose it's a kind of, if you can write a book for abstract reasons, but it's always helped if there's some personal reason you want to do it. My father was still alive, and I thought, he died this year actually, but I thought it'd be nice to do a book on GBS for him, just before he was.
Okay. Who old do you say is comparable to GBS in terms of reach and relevance, but during his times and contemporary and his times and nowadays? Difficult.
Yes, maybe a slightly negative answer, but I don't think we have a kind of figure anymore. I think one of the difficulties of modern culture is we've separated out serious thinking on the one side, serious artistic endeavor on the one side, and popular discourse on the other side. And GBS was writing at a time when most people read newspapers, even poor people, if they were literate at all, they read newspapers. They read 2 or 3 newspapers, they were cheap. People would go to the theatre, ordinary people went to the theatre, certainly in Ireland they did, just for entertainment, and yet they might see a play by Shaw or Shakespeare or something, it didn't matter. And so this distinction between high culture and low culture, I think, is very damaging. It sort of makes this kind of separation. Yeah. Could it be done again? I think it could. But I think we probably live in a culture which maybe is just very different. Maybe it's much more open. Maybe we don't trust godlike intellectuals anymore, which may be good in one way. Maybe we shouldn't. But the good side is we're much more skeptical. Everybody contributes on Twitter and Facebook, and everybody's kind of part of the conversation in a way. The bad side is that we don't allow ourselves to be challenged as much. The great thing about something like GBS was it was always challenging, always asking you to think. And even if you didn't agree with them, people didn't agree with them really enjoyed reading because it provoked them to think about things. And I can't think of a figure now who can cross those divides. So we all decide, I'm on the left, I really like these figures, and I'm a feminist, and I really like those figures, and that's quite right. Of course, we should identify with intellectuals who illuminate our own thoughts. But very few of us, I think, anymore have these kind of figures who we would read whether we agree with them or not. And I think it's maybe one of the problems with our democracy. Our intellectual life is becoming very tribalized. We tend only to read the people who reinforce our way of thinking. And that's dangerous, I think, in the long term. strongly about what they feel, or that we should not be willing to condemn views that we find offensive or dangerous or fascistic. We should. But do we have anything that transcends that? Actually, do we have figures in our contemporary culture who we share? So from the right and from the left, and from our perspective, we have figures we share by thinking, actually what she says is really important and interesting, whether I agree with it or not. I think that's the difference. And I don't quite know whether we'll ever get back to that kind of stage, because I think our culture has become very fragmented in many ways.
Last question. A lot of Brazilians have gone to Ireland either to work or study. Do you see an influence of Brazilian culture and their Brazilian presence in the contemporary Ireland?
Yes. So one of the very interesting things about Brazilian migration into Ireland is that unusually a lot of Brazilians didn't go to the big cities. I think initially when people went to work, a lot of people came from they had skills, they worked in the meat industry, which is one thing Ireland and Brazil would share. Beef is a big thing, and so I think the first people, I may be wrong, but my impression is the first people who came were working in meat plants. And meat plants tend not to be in the cities, they tend to be in small communities out in the countryside. So you got a couple of places in Ireland which were very rural, country, small country towns, where you had quite large Brazilian communities. And this is unusual. Usually migration is towards the go to a new place. So the market. But actually, I think it was kind of wonderful because the Brazilian people who went were mostly young. They were very beautiful, of course, being Brazilian. They've been very popular. They've integrated into the society very well. I think more people are now going as students and sort of probably living in the big cities more and more. But I think the Brazilian community in Ireland is quite a mixed community. So there's a lot of working class people, and there's a lot of students or people who are slightly better off. And it's actually created, I think, a very vibrant presence. I think the Brazilians are very, very popular. They're very admired. I think Irish people really like the Brazilians. They feel Irish people have a sense of, you should work hard and play hard. You should be serious at work, and then you should enjoy yourself. And I think we see the Brazilians as being similar. That the Brazilian people who come are fantastic workers and really work very, very hard, but they also enjoy life and know how to have fun. So I think culturally the mix is very good, and you're beginning to see Brazilian food, certainly in the cities, and of course people fall in love, So I think one of the reasons why the Irish community is rising in Sao Paulo, for example, is I think there's quite a number of people who've met a Brazilian guy or Brazilian girl in Ireland, and then they've married or got together and come back to Brazil. So I think it's an interesting relationship which is developing. It's come from nothing. 15 years ago, there wouldn't have been any real popular relationship between Ireland and Brazil, and now there is. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think when people in their own lives, people really enjoy migration. It's fun. It's part of the diversity of life. And I think, and I hope, most you probably know more, but anybody I know who has been in Ireland from Brazil, they've had a good time. That makes me happy. I would feel very bad if people felt any resentment at them or felt that they were being treated as outsiders. I hope they're not. When we think about all the depressing things at the moment, and all the reactionary politics and all of the nasty right-wing politics going on, we have to remind ourselves that these things are happening as a reaction to good things. That these people are on the losing side of history. They're losing their grip. sorts of ways, some of them terrible, some of them in situations of gross inequality, some of them in situations of crisis, but a lot of it also in situations of just ordinary human interaction, which people are making their lives around. You know, they're getting married, they're having kids, they're they're living in each other's countries, they're, you know, it's isn't it a wonderful thing? And some people will always find that difficult to cope with because it's new. But it is, it's not going to be automatic. Once we've got into this kind of globalized culture, we're going to like it. We just have to try to evolve ways of what do we do with it? How do we, if our cultures become globalized, how do we become global citizens? How do we behave as if we are part of the world, which we are? I mean, I think Brazil has a great future in all of this. You know, I think, I know you're having a difficult time now. You've had a very difficult economic recession, and you've got a political crisis. But you know, Brazil is still at a stage where it's growing, it's learning, it's developing. You're going to have to do new things, you know, whether you like it or not, because of the pressure of society and the way it's going. In particular, Brazil is the place where probably the most important questions in the world are going to be answered, which are the questions about the environment and about how do we live on the planet. You know, this is for good or ill. I don't know whether you like it or don't like it, but the fact is, Brazil has